institutional capital moving into the space of not only crypto, but also into things I think within the investment community that are starting to be addressed around the world. We've already seen movement with the Fidelity this week. We've seen activity in this space from a lot of structured capital in the past few years. The question is how will this go forward into the next bull run, and also maybe into redeveloping, or I guess developing for the first time, a new standard of how institutional capital might be coming in. So I wanted to bring on a special guest today. I think it's going to be a good one. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back into Tech Path. Joining me today is Colin Butler, who is the Global Head of Institutional Capital at Polygon Labs. So great to have you, Colin.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here.
So let's get into a little bit about what you do there at Polygon Labs. Let's learn about what the job role is. I mean, it looks like a somewhat title there that says, hey, I'm working on institutional capital, but is there anything secret that you can give us right now and up front?
Yeah, I think the big question is, what does that mean? I think that there's probably a lot of misunderstandings around it. If you think of Polygon at its core as really a technology, an infrastructure technology, the reason why we speak with institutions is because they are some of the larger players that can come help us secure our network so that we can then provide a free service, free network to the public. And really what that means, just to break it down for everybody, is people stake on our network, which creates the security for our network. And so that's why it's very helpful for us to have that dialogue with institutional partners. And then in return for their staking, they get staking rewards.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at just the landscape in general. If you look at where Polygon is going and also the adoption curve that we've already seen with Ethereum, and also just the aspect of what I think a lot of general investors are starting to look to, are institutions more interested in ETH, or are you seeing them kind of more interested in Bitcoin and all assets across the board? What's kind of been the temperature?
Yeah, if you're really internal to Polygon, you think of it a lot less in terms of assets as opposed to an infrastructure and a utility. So think of the idea as our vision for the blockchain space. And you also have to differentiate between, like the old saying, right? Bitcoin, not blockchain, or blockchain, not Bitcoin. The reality is why institutional adoption is happening is it because it provides a standard of value for which there previously was none. Like, it provides a lot of functionality, a lot of utility that was just never there before. Think in terms of cost savings or increase in revenue. And then in some cases, you could think of the idea that there's a solution there for which there was no prior solution. I can kind of get in more deeply into that, but that's the basis for institutional adoption. And so when you ask kind of like Ethereum versus the other chains, because of its high level security and high level of decentralization, we see Ethereum as really the global settlement layer, and Polygon wants to be the execution layer on top of it, essentially providing faster and cheaper Ethereum. Like they're in the future, they're going to look a lot more like one and the
same. Colin, when this, obviously we've already started to see this adoption curve take place with really the success of what we've seen with Polygon. If you think about Ethereum and transaction activity, will this over time start to fall on Ethereum as we see Polygon's adoption starting to grow? How will that wait out?
Yeah, again, our view is Ethereum as the global settlement layer. The idea that payment rails and call it credit card settlements, and eventually, as Larry Fink at BlackRock would say very publicly recently, it's like he can't wait for the time that equities and derivatives all settle on chain. Like, I think of it as rewiring the global financial infrastructure. So if you're settling trades and receivables, so on and so forth, all on chain, then the use of Ethereum expands almost parabolically from this point forward, if that makes sense.
I mean, we are big fans of what's happening in Web3. Obviously, ETH, Polygon kind of leading the charge there. If you look at the landscape of institutional capital advisors, you look at companies and brands starting to move in this direction. Do you feel that the adoption curve has even started yet, or is it still kind of the early stages, everybody's kicking the tire?
It's a really interesting question. It's still very early days, but having said that, the things that you're going to see on the institutional front in the coming weeks and months, like the big announcements, essentially all the major brands are coming into the space, but very few people actually know about it. It's highly regulated industry. They don't talk about it until they make the announcement. But from my perspective within Polygon, that all is happening very, very quickly. It's taken years and years with a lot of people working really hard in the background to get to the place that we're at and the level that we're at. But I think the public is now going to be very aware of the significant use of blockchain in the financial industry going forward. I think the adoption curve has really already started. I would say it's right at that inflection point. It's just that none of these places talk to each other, and it's certainly not publicly yet, because if they make it public, it becomes a competitive disadvantage for them. They really have to wait until all systems are go and everything is dialed in before they can make the announcement. The big announcement, they'd call it like the $1 trillion plus players are really building on the blockchain and using it as that utility.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, we've watched this happen in front of our eyes when we do a review on projects and different integrations with major companies, and it looks as though they're not quite ready, and then all of a sudden they're ready. And it's back to your point. There's a lot of building going on in the background, and then boom, they start dropping, a lot of alpha into the marketplace. And it does give them kind of a competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you think of the institutional space and you look at the funds that have tokenized so far, right? I think the big announcement that really kicked off a lot of this interest was KKR. It was a deal done by Securitize, built on Avalanche. And then Hamilton Lane, about a month ago, at this point, announced that they had tokenized some of their fund, their flagship equity fund, on Polygon. You're going to see a lot more of that happening. So the cadence is going to be increased dramatically. It's going to be announcement after announcement after announcement. That's what I see in the pipeline. And it's going to gradually shift from the fundraising to the assets being tokenized. So starting with structured products, and then to private credit, and then to bonds. And there's a host of reasons why the shift is being driven right now. But it largely surrounds the idea that things are, going on chain can be much, much more, it's much more cost effective. In the cases of the funds, it allows them to tap a distribution pipeline that they never really had before. Because you can think of the idea that, if you're a Hamilton Lane, this fund that was tokenized is really generating a mid-teens return. And prior to tokenization, the only people that could really purchase that were qualified purchasers, the $5 million more, qualified purchase benchmark. Tokenization allows that mix to shift to the accredited investor or the mass affluent, with a very, say, a much lower minimum. In the US, call it like $20,000. So this right now, what's happening is the democratization of finance. So you're getting access to vehicles for which previously only the wealthy had access to.
Right.
And then you can get deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole into the crypto use cases and DeFi and borrowing against those things. But in my view, from my seat, like all of that infrastructure is being built right now.
Yeah, and it sounds like, based on what you're saying, also what we're seeing, our own research, there is seemingly right now a bit of a groundswell that's really started to accelerate in the last 6 to 8 months, I would say. Some of this may be in timing with how the markets may respond, of what we'll see, everything from the Bitcoin halving to these cycles that have existed before, which I think are probably going to start to disappear as these kinds of integrations really start at the top level, especially with institutional capital. So it's interesting that you're kind of saying that, because I would agree. I think the acceleration point, I think we're right there at the precipice of something very big right now in the markets for sure.
100%. I see it as a tidal wave of institutional capital coming in.
Yeah.
And it's starting now.
All right.
It's already
there
starting.
You go. That was a perfect sound clip. We'll lead to another couple other questions, and I want to talk about long term. When you think about Polygon and the partnership, the integration with Ethereum, and then we'll look at real use case scenarios that have started to be kind of not necessarily reshifting their strategy, but I think reassessing what's been happening. Obviously, we've reported heavily here on both Artifact, Nike, and of course, Starbucks. Here recently, just last week, Meta comes out and says, wait a minute, we think we're going to back away from NFTs. Do you think that is a big blow to Web3 as a whole? Or do you think maybe Meta is just, let's step back a second, we want to get this right when we do integrate? What is your opinion?
Yeah, I don't think it's a blow. I think that announcement had to do purely with things that are happening with Meta. So I view that as, it's just a problem within that entity. It's not a broader problem with Web3. I
Right.
look at Web3 as like a lot of people, right? It's like the adoption of the internet. And right now, historically, if you want to make a comparison, we're probably at like 1998 in a multi-decade secular shift towards Web3 based on all of the use cases, including NFTs and ownership of digital assets and disintermediation of the traditional financial infrastructure. Like that is only increasing in all of those verticals, including gaming, as time goes on. So I absolutely don't see that as a step back for the industry by any means. And by industry, I'm really talking about the blockchain industry. I'm talking about like the
Yeah.
technology and the infrastructure that underlies the shift.
Well, and I'll reference this to even Microsoft when I was a young engineer working with Microsoft. We did a lot of times was opposite of what the trends were really leaning into when it came to the adoption of the internet. So not every company is going to understand the exact model to take Web3 forward. There's going to be some winners and losers. I hope that Meta is not one of those. I think they have enough forward thinking to kind of jump into that ship and see this curve kind of adopt itself. So it'll be interesting to watch. I want to talk about zkEVM, the recent move in terms of the date. When do you think this is going to finally launch? This obviously will have a big impact on a lot of things within this protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our engineers, some of whom came from the original, subset of Ethereum people, would say this zk EVM is the biggest development for blockchain since Ethereum, since the
Mm-hmm.
development of this tract. What this does for us, and I think the world, is it expands the block space available on Ethereum, expands the throughput, makes it much less expensive, and makes it much faster. And so really for us, it's again, you're going to lose that distinction over time, like Ethereum versus Polygon. It's just much more of like a whole integrated solution that has very high throughput. It has the ability to scale. I think Vitalik would say zk is really the holy grail of Ethereum scaling and blockchain scaling, and that's really what this shift represents. And then I think as an addendum to that, if you think in terms of finance and institutional capital, where I sit, if you are moving billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars around on the blockchain, you need that ultra high level of security. Essentially, the ability to submit proofs from the execution layer back to Ethereum without ultimately having or taking bridge risk. Right, that's something that
Right.
just can't happen. So zk EVM is really something that enables all of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot you guys can, of course, find if you guys just follow the Polygon website, just go polygon.technology. You'll find a lot more on zk. We've done a couple of videos on this, so I think there is a lot in the way of where advancements are going, and I think obviously what you guys have done and what is happening in the marketplace is going to be pretty significant. When you think about this rollout, and you look at the Web2 companies that are really starting to really look at new strategies for Web3. We've already seen many of them take their first step. Is there any companies or sectors of the industry that you think might say, okay, this is what we've been waiting for. Let's move forward on some of our strategy implementation?
I would say it's across the board. I think almost everybody has a Web3 strategy at this point, and some
Mm-hmm.
entities have had it for a long time. For the financial industry, it's a question of inches, and they just keep moving like another inch every month. But they're definitely not stopping, and they know what the goal looks like. They know where they want to arrive in terms of the efficiency and the cost savings and the just order of magnitude better infrastructure than kind of the creaky Wall Street infrastructure that has been, in place for decades and ultimately in
Yeah.
some spots very inefficient. So that's just the space that I come from. That's the institutional side. In terms of Web 2, absolutely. I mean, if you think of the excitement around gaming and the things that you're going to see put into place over the next, 6, 12, 18 months, I mean, just look at the things that Ryan is talking about. Ryan Wyatt, president of Polygon Labs, former head of gaming at YouTube. Like this is really cool stuff coming online, and it's not just in gaming, it's not just in finance. You know, just look at the Nikes and the Starbucks and the loyalty
Hmm.
rewards programs, the things that they're doing in terms of like collections. I feel like to me, it's just not limited to one silo. I feel like everybody's moving forward almost at their pace. And to me, like on the infrastructure from where I sit, it's very, very fast. I realize if you're
Yeah.
not working directly in the industry, like here or there, it's kind of scattered at the moment. But in my going to change for everybody, really, like at some point, it's it's like that old adage, right? Like very slowly and then all
Then
at
all at
once. And
once.
now that you and I finally get to see all at once.
Yeah. I was looking at some of
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
latest, yeah, the latest news. Nike digital sales account for 27% of their total revenue in Q3. So we've started to see a real, ramp up there. You look at also just the collection on Starbucks. We've done a deep dive on Starbucks and their usage. This is just showing some of the collections available in their app right now. And remember, with Starbucks, for some of you that you maybe didn't get a chance to catch our video, this is really a very closed and limited release on this beta that they're utilizing. So there's a lot happening to your point is there's a lot of Web 2 companies that are really starting to integrate their Web 3 strategies now. And of course, Starbucks, Nike, some good examples. With the scenarios that are starting to come in on the aspect of, and I'll say, one of the biggest problems in the SaaS world is the recurring revenue concept, the idea of what crypto has been kind of hamstrung to a certain extent of being able to execute on that. You guys obviously will see this change here very shortly. How much of a shift in just in general SaaS services, because that's most of right now, if you think of Web 2, there's a lot of SaaS services out there, which is for some of you, software as a service. Your Netflix is basically a SaaS product. Crypto has been a problem. I mean, we even ourselves, we have our own membership base. We can't use crypto unless we're doing one-off transactions. What do you think that does when we do see this technology really start to take hold for Web 2 in that area of memberships and services like that?
Yeah, I think the answer is it depends. It depends on every specific use case. I think it's just a range across the board, and the range is almost so vast. I don't even think I could speak to it. But what I will say is, Polygon is really laser focused on onboarding that next billion users, right, in various forms, whether it's the Starbucks or the Nike. But I also think of the financial services industry as a
Mm-hmm.
way to onboard additional users. Like,
Yep.
think of the idea that currently, if you go to a mom and pop or your local grocery store and you use your Visa card, ultimately that merchant is paying, somewhere around 3%.
Yep.
And blockchain is a way to dramatically reduce those costs. So this technology, in my view, gets put in the hands of, from our perspective, all 8 billion people in the world. Like that's where we want it to go. And I think you are seeing just an acceleration of that type of adoption, just with the use cases that you just mentioned.
Yeah, Colin. Okay, so you hit on something there, and that is this apparent changing of the guard between what has been standard merchant services to what we're seeing now with transactions. A good example for many of you business owners out there that are watching our show. A good example is, for instance, we use Coinbase Commerce. The Coinbase Commerce fees are 1%. That's literally almost 1/3 of what typical merchant services are transacting at if you're taking a credit card. Now, there are some limitations there. It's a little bit different cycle, but it's very early stage. How how do you think Visa, MasterCard, Amex, et cetera, would eventually come to the blockchain? Because obviously they're not going to want to lose this merchant service business, which essentially runs their entire ecosystem and profitability. How do you think that industry is going to adapt to this?
Yeah, I see it as an integration. I think that the major players that you mentioned and a host of financial services companies like banks see this coming. They're not going to be fully disintermediated by this technology. So they are looking to combine. And my future vision, 5 to 10 years down the road, is it looks like a hybrid. It's not a full changing of the guard. It's
Okay.
that where it makes sense, the traditional players will integrate blockchain technology to lower their costs and serve their customers better. And so over time, they will meet each other in the middle, right? It won't be just a complete, disruption. 1 year, it's all one or the other. And then 10 years later, the traditional infrastructure is gone. It's going to be the same players that you see 10 years from now, only it's going to be a cheaper cost to the consumer and a savings of costs on the back end in terms of the provider.
Yeah, just some data here, just to kind of put a framework around this. When 4337 comes into play, the potential economy there for, and this is a little blurry, but this shows the economy right now of subscription level economy versus what we see in even things like the S&P. This is not that they compete to each other, it's just showing the scale of the size. And then you look at this right here, these are the stats on subscription, the subscription economy right now, which is set to grow to 1.5 trillion by 2025. To me, I look at this and then I think of what's happening with 4337, the ability of being able to scale Ethereum and Polygon, of course, in unison. There's a lot of growth here, opportunity. The question will be, how fast are those adoption curves? Kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier, is if you look at the bell curve, the internet adoption has a lot of eerily similar traits to what's happening here in Web3. If there was one or two areas, Colin, that you're worried about or you kind of lose sleep at night about, what are some of the challenges that you see in the future, whether it's institutional capital and or institutional clients, and also Web2 making this transition and this leap forward? What would that be?
The big one I think on everybody's mind is thoughtful regulation. Like, how does blockchain fit into the regulator's view of how this industry should progress? If we get thoughtful regulation, this technology probably has a lot of legs. It probably, adoption happens much sooner than people think. If we don't necessarily get that, it will still progress because it is like that order of magnitude better technology in a lot of ways. It's still going to come to the marketplace. It will just be along a different sort of a vertical or come from a different direction, if that makes sense. And I guess to be more concrete in what I'm trying to say, the infrastructure is absolutely going to be rewired. It will just be largely done like out of view. That part of the whole kind of crypto blockchain business is there's no argument over how that should be thought of. It's
Right.
more of the token side of things. And again, at Polygon, like, we really think of it at its core as just really we're an infrastructure provider. We're a technology provider, right? So the part that will be potentially less well adopted would be something that I personally don't necessarily focus on as much anyway, because from my seat, the service that I think we can provide as a public blockchain is absolutely valuable to the vast majority of companies out there. It's certainly highly, highly valuable to the financial services industry.
You mentioned Ryan Watt. We got a chance to see him and the guys over at IMX this week about that partnership. We had a video on that. This could move forward some pretty significant user uptake. And then you look at, some of the mobile gaming aspect of what's happening in the space right now. Netflix, for example, releasing 40 mobile games coming into the space. This is, again, going to be more mainstream. And the opportunity, Polygon, I would say, is somewhat leading the way in the gaming sector right now in terms of blockchain, potentially Web3. But more importantly, I think it's starting to, when you looked at what happened at GDC this last week, it feels to me like Web3 has almost merged already with just gaming in general. It's just a different cycle of maybe some different rails. What are your thoughts on how that growth may occur?
It's got a long way to go. I mean, this is just the beginning. It's super exciting. Like, I think that you can look at the developments in terms of IMX and how zk plays a role in that picture. And I think it's definitely worth doing a deep dive. Like, definitely get, kind of Ryan's view, because he articulates the vision very, very succinctly. It's a little bit outside of my space, but when we have internal conversations about that side of the house, it is very, very cool. But I don't think it's definitely not come to your average user yet. Like the current iteration of Call of Duty doesn't have digital assets, fully integrated by any way, shape, or form. it takes 12 to 18 months to spin up a triple A game, like one of those like
Mm-hmm.
really cool first person games that people really want to play, or a strategy game. That's all in the works. When that stuff really starts hitting, going mainstream, I think that's when you can say, okay, wow, this is, now adoption is really occurring at an accelerated pace. I think that is, that's probably closer than a lot of people think. And again, it's super exciting. But I would say right now, as of this moment, that, your average person is probably not aware of this shift just yet.
Yeah. A lot of that is because of these walled gardens that have existed. Apple has been pretty much I will call them the nemesis of Web3, of being able to really integrate within that, which I think has spurred the strategies from, companies like Microsoft. I was just looking at this, Xbox's, Phil Spencer, he was discussing this new storefront. Basically, now Microsoft soon to have a very similar experience to what we've seen in the app stores. The question is Microsoft seems to be a much more Web3 centered company. At least they are showing signs of it, which could open up some interesting potentials there. So I agree with you. It's still very early, but to your point, once that we get one of those mainstreams really connecting the dots, the opportunity is going to be pretty big for sure. One other question I want to jump to you: how far are, say, like just a Bitcoin, say layer 2, away from maybe seeing at least an institutional capital angle on this? You look at ordinals as what's been happening within the Bitcoin ecosystem. Do you think that's going to make a difference in terms of institutional capital coming into the space, those kinds of advancements?
My guess is that they would, but what I'm seeing is the current combination of Ethereum and Polygon. Like that to me is the category killer. Like that is just a very dominant solution for these large, traditional, very conservative institutions. And that's what I think the conversation is focused on right now.
Yeah. All right. So roadmap. Let's talk about 2023 outlook. We've got a lot of financial headwinds right now facing us, both from an economic front, macro front. Obviously, we just saw the Fed announce another quarter point yesterday. Institutional capital starting to move into the space a little bit. We're seeing moves from Fidelity offering Ethereum. We even asked them, I think, on our live stream the other day, when we might see MATIC on Fidelity, which they have 2 assets now. Because to me, that really gets into the mainstream aspect of investors that are going to start to say, well, what's this? And then they explore, and maybe it's a business owner that says, wait a minute, how can I use this, for my tool sets? But when you look at the roadmap, what's in line for you guys for the rest of the year?
Yeah, I think you're going to see, in terms of our roadmap, consistent improvements to zkEVM, consistent improvements to the technology. I think Polygon has led certain segments of blockchain technology for a while now, or for a little while, certain segments. Just to be very clear, we really have some of the cutting edge tech that's coming out. And so I think that we're going to keep improving on that. Like our goal is to keep the lead and keep the innovation coming really years ahead of, I think, where a lot of people that are outside the blockchain space and even inside the blockchain space think it can be. So I think that's going to be a primary driver. You're also going to see a lot of announcements coming out in terms of adoption, like people that you will be surprised by, large institutional players. It might not come from the angle that I think people thought it would come from, but in terms of a utility, like this technology is vastly disruptive. I mean, you can think, settlements being 90% cheaper than, prior technology. You could think of settlements being, the idea that a receivable settlement could take 28 days and now it's done in a day. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
why this adoption is occurring. It's just an order of magnitude better solution for a lot of use cases than the infrastructure that was available prior.
So you said a key thing there, not coming, these adoption, markers maybe coming in ways that the market isn't expecting. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that if you look at what Fidelity is doing, which we're huge fans of, in terms of their recent public announcements incorporating Bitcoin into their 401ks, that's all great. But all those big financial services players can use this technology on the back end.
Right.
as really like this is the utility use case, right? Like massive cost savings, massive gains in efficiency. Like this is a big deal when you're talking trillions of dollars of capital and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in expenses. So
Hmm.
this almost goes back to the differentiator, right? Like, you know, blockchain, not Bitcoin. You really have to
Right.
make that distinction very clear at some point. And I see the
Yeah.
blockchain adoption cycle, really accelerating up into the right, and it already is. I mean, my wife is like, "You are going to have a heart attack if you keep going this fast." Like every day for me is very intense because to me, it's all happening right now. Like I see the 3 to 6 month roadmap, and it feels like
Mhm.
I've already lived it, and it is very very exciting.
Well, I think, when we see these kinds of shifts in technology, we've had a chance to live through this once before when, in 2000, when really the birth of the World Wide Web, we started to see the accelerant point of how companies, both at that time, we'll call them brick and mortar versus click and mortar, and the evolution that came very quickly there. You mentioned adoption curve, especially when you think Rails and you look at integration speed and what you're talking about, that it eventually funds the top of that funnel, which is, if you think of the internet, yes, not many people understood what HTTP was, nor did they understand what, you know, today even what a DNS is. So to a certain extent, that kind of technology is what you're mentioning here, but it has a lot of impact on the top side, Web 2 to Web 3, which is this next conversion, and really the expansion of how people are going to just use blockchain in general. So do you think that will be finally, it'll click to say, okay, blockchain, oh yeah, we use this. Oh yeah, now I see how I can invest in it. And do you think that's when the lights will come on for the average person out there?
It's really tough to say. We generally aren't focused on the investment aspect of the blockchain world within Polygon because for us, the infrastructure is so powerful. One
Right.
analogy I think you could make that might be accurate is think about Linux, right? Like how much of the current internet that infrastructure underlies, and it's massive. Think of the idea that, to be honest, I'm not even sure Amazon would have survived at times when it was a
Mm-hmm.
scrappy startup, potentially underfunded, without the essentially free infrastructure that Linux provided. And Polygon, to some degree, and public blockchain could be thought of along those lines. To your point, like people don't know what DNS is. It's kind of back to like TCP/IP, right? The underlying
Mm-hmm.
protocol for the whole internet. Very few people, like everyone uses the internet, but very few people even have you even heard the word or the acronym TCP/IP, right?
Yeah,
The infrastructure products that are coming out now, Ethereum and the Polygon solution combined, could largely be thought of in that way.
for sure. Hey, Colin, stick around for a minute. I want to chat with you afterwards. I had a quick question for you. I wanted to do it off camera, but listen, we really appreciate you guys coming in today. Thank you so much for stopping in. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul. It's been my pleasure.
Excellent. All right, you guys are tuned in maybe over on the podcast side of things right now. Make sure and jump over here to the YouTube channel. And this is where you can subscribe, of course, to the Diamond Circle. That's our normal membership program. And it's a way for us to give you guys additional content. Of course, if you want to reach me, it's very simple. Just hit me out there on Twitter at Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.